Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. This is testing your world view. The New York Times published an article in 1987 saying the right minimum wage is $0.00, saying there's a virtual consensus among economists that the minimum wage is an idea whose time has passed. Raising the minimum wage by a substantial amount would price working poor people out of the job market. Yeah, increasing the price means less people will consume the product or service. A far better way to help them, because the New York Times, you can't really get published in the New York Times if you advocate no state violence against peaceful people. A far better way to help them would be to subsidize their wages. Okay, so make people more dependent on the violent mass murdering state. Better yet, help them acquire the skills needed to earn more on their own. See, the author knows that 12 years of government education is so bad that you need to learn skills. But I've just been educated for 12 years. Yep, you learn nothing. You need to learn more. It would increase unemployment, raise the legal minimum price of labor above the productivity of the least skilled workers, and fewer will be hired. A higher minimum would undoubtedly raise the living standard of the majority of low-wage workers who could keep their jobs, so the people with a lot of skills, a lot of experience won't hurt them, except in their capacity to have their own startup business and compete with the big guys. That gain, is argued, would justify the sacrifice of the minority who became unemployable. See, these are gods making decisions on behalf of the rest of us. Your worldview comes into play when we need government minimums, because if there was no minimum, then people would just get paid $0. Everyone would be working for pennies on the dollar. This would be so terrible. We need government regulation or everything would be filthy and disgusting. There's no market competition. There's no incentive for people to create quality products and services without the state violently intervening. Well, we can actually test this worldview of yours, Mr. Status. The average minimum, the minimum wage, according to the U.S. Department of Labor federally, is $7.25 an hour. Now, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, about 2.3% earn the minimum wage. So, according to the worldview of businesses and the free market will just pay the lowest possible, let's say 99% of all people would be paid the minimum wage, the absolute minimum. That is according to the worldview of we need government to constantly intervene or everything would be terrible and of the lowest quality and no one would be taken care of. That is false. Your worldview is wrong. Now, there are no jobs or jobs are disappearing because look at how few people work in such industries like manufacturing. Well, you need to apply that logic to things that have happened in the past if you're going to tell us what the future holds. The percentage of Americans in the workforce in 1840 in the agricultural sector was about 68%, and now it's about 2%. But according to the Paul Ehrlichs of the world and the Greta Thunbergs who say the world is going to hell in a handbasket, or the Tucker Carlsons who say there's not going to be any stuff in America, it's all being outsourced to China, there's no jobs are being shipped. Well, here's what happens. People find new industries. That is what's happened in the past. There's a pretty low unemployment rate now, and productivity increases because there's investment, there's innovation, there's competition, there's profit incentive. These things are, when people have the right to voluntarily exchange, it still is okay. The alarmists begging for the violent state to intervene everywhere are they're just wrong. They have no historical, economic, or moral justification for the state intervening. And, I'm constantly told, oh, you're unscientific, you just believe in utopian, libertarian ideas. Well, no, let's test your worldview. Does the government represent us? That's why you say it's morally justified the government does everything it does. Well, according to your worldview, if the government represents us, how is it openly a joke that no one is getting into Area 51? When I think there were like 2 million people who signed that petition wanting to know what the government's up to in one of its many secret facilities. And it was just such a laughing joke. You're not getting in there. The government's going to murder you if you try. Everyone knew that was the case. And they still say the words, government represents us. Okay, let's investigate. Nope, these are declassified documents. Oh, Chelsea Manning, if you release any of our murderers and tell the world about them, well, we're going to put you in a cage. They'll be fine, of course. And by the way, we represent you. You can't opt out of funding this, and if you try to look into it, we'll kill you or cage you if it's Area 51, cage you if you release government secrets. You'll have to go to Russia if you're Snowden. And the CIA and NSA said, well, the publisher never gave us, we never gave the publisher the green light for Snowden to publish those documents in his new book. The government does not represent you. You can also take their 13% approval rating, but even that, many Americans know nothing about their government. Here's a bold way schools can fix that. Two terrible things in one headline. The Washington Post has under their name, "Democracy Dies in Darkness." Well, democracy, people voting, is obviously bad because according to your own article, many Americans know nothing about their government. So why would you want people involved in something they're completely ignorant about? We should vote on how heart surgery is done and how computers are made, because when people vote, that means it's morally justified. Of course not. Getting a bunch of ignorant people involved in something doesn't improve quality or truth at all. Here's a bold way schools can fix this. Well, the second part of that is also nonsense because, again, you need to test your worldview. That increasing school funding does not increase results. It just gets you more propaganda. 375% over the last 30 years has been the general increase in education. I mean, we should all be like Aristotle with the amount of money the state spends on education. And of course, we get a totally ignorant populace who votes for Bernie and Trump and Warren and Hillary and Bush Sr. And another way you need to test your worldview, this is the big one. A lot of people say, it would have come out if it were true. So anytime you mention something that the establishment media hasn't told me is legitimate, I mean, I'm not going to believe it because they would have told us about it if it were true. Well, ask people if they know about the Venona papers. It turns out Joseph McCarthy was totally right, and 349 Soviet communists infiltrated the U.S. State Department. They did the same thing in Britain. It was called the Cambridge Five. Now, today, it's like they're obsessed with Russian interference, yet they bash McCarthy. So when there is any Russian espionage today, it's a total justification for, national sovereignty and we can't let others interfere with us. But when there's a legitimate conspiracy amongst the Americans coming out of Moscow, you're just called a McCarthyite and someone who's ridiculous. And also, did you know about the McCullen memo? I mean, if you watch this channel, you probably did. But in 1994, a document was declassified. So surely, what's it been? 25 years? We should all pretty much know about this by now if it's been declassified for 25 years. The document basically says here's 8 ways we could get the Japanese to attack us at Pearl Harbor and justify entrance into the Second World War. Did you know that FDR was totally on board with this plan? And he said it to Churchill, originally wanting the Germans to make the first move. But he ended up implementing 7 of the 8 steps in the McCullen memo. So it's not just, okay, some loony had some idea and wrote it down. No, these were implemented at the highest levels. Most importantly, the Export Control Act of 1940. Did you know the Lusitania was a total setup? You can find this in a book, The Intimate Papers of Colonel House, published by Yale University, came out in the 1920s. Oh, but if it were true, it would have gotten out by now. It's out, but the Mockingbird media hasn't focused on it. On page 432, House is talking about a conversation he had with Sir Edward Grey, a British diplomat. On the morning of May 7th, House and Grey drove out to Kew. We spoke of the probability of an ocean liner being sunk, recorded House. I told him, if this were done, a flame of indignation would sweep across America, which would, in itself, probably carry us into the war. An hour later, House was with King George in Buckingham Palace. We fell to talking, strangely enough, the colonel wrote that night, of the probability of Germany sinking a transatlantic liner. He said, suppose they should sink the Lusitania with American passengers on board. Now, of course, the Lusitania was said, well, there was just butter and people innocently transferring. It was like the Titanic, but instead of an iceberg, it was the evil Kaiser Wilhelm. Well, of course, it wasn't until the 1980s when the London Archives, I think it was 1982, the London Archives released that. Of course, there were munitions on board. It was sent there deliberately, knowing it would be attacked to justify entrance into a war, just like Pearl Harbor. Did you know that National Security Presidential Directive 9 said that the U.S. plans to go into Afghanistan on the justification of fighting Al-Qaeda and overthrowing the Taliban. All these wars are planned, and then an excuse is looked for them afterwards. And then things are arranged for something to happen to use as a justification for intervening. This October 25th, 2001 memo matches with the National Security Presidential Directive 9 of September 4th, 2001, talking about military operations against Taliban targets in Afghanistan. It was already planned. And then, of course, the biggest one that they just say, oh, Alex Jones is so crazy, he thinks that chemicals are turning the frogs gay. Well, we have primary documents actually supporting that this is a thing that's happening. Well, if it were true, we would have heard about it by now. Well, how about the fact that the government openly sprays chemicals on civilians and killing them en masse, making their environment much worse off? Oh, we need government to protect the environment. Without government, the environment will be bad. Here are some Agent Orange photos. We have victims, and we have the conspirators setting up. Imagine, you think people are crazy now when they look at FEMA camps and saying, hey, what is that stuff for? What's it going to be used for? Would you have ever thought seeing a bunch of barrels? Well, those are going to be used to spray chemicals over civilians, making us look like the guy in the upper right-hand corner giving an interview on what it was like being sprayed by the chemicals. And this is just indiscriminate spraying. We also have Operation Sea Spray. Oh, government would never spray chemicals amongst its citizens. A 1950 U.S. Navy secret experiment in which Sierra Massacane... There's not a chance in hell I'm going to be able to pronounce that. Bacteria were sprayed over the San Francisco Bay Area in California from February 20th to the 27th in 1950. This happened. Oh, but if it were true, it would have come out. Based on the results, there were about 43 locations where the Army did this. And it actually killed some people. Edward J. Nevin died 3 days later after these attacks. Also, Operation LAC, a U.S. Army Chemical Corps operation which dispersed microscopic zinc cadmium sulfide particles over much of the United States and Canada. So it's, oh, they would never do it. Okay, well, they did it, but they were at war. And when it's war, everything's justified. All right, well, here's a couple examples of them doing it to American citizens, unbeknownst to them. Oh, well, that doesn't count. It's in our best interest. I'm keeping my pathetic worldview that the state is virtuous. And finally, we have one of the greatest examples right in your face of the worldview being absolutely flipped on its head. The idea is there's a predatory private sector, corporations are out to get you, and we need government to stop us from evil, greedy billionaires and the 1% from exploiting us all. Well, no one feared Donald Trump when he was in the private sector. Today, most people think he's an evil, lying, racist, or any of the other things. There was a Never Trump movement within the Republican Party. If your worldview is accurate, that we need government to protect us from private actors, we would have been terrified of Trump up until the day he was inaugurated, and then we'd be totally cool with him. But we know, he's funding genocide in Yemen, palling around with the Saudis, selling them billions in weapons, and stealing trillions every year in taxation, all this other nonsense, banning vaping and whatever God complex things that he likes to do. So this is another way that your worldview needs to adjust to what actually happens. It's an excellent test. Let me know in the comments below the last significant thing you changed your mind on. Thank you for watching Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone.